Welcome to Olive Tree Community Spokane. The following recording is from our Boker Shabbat or Sabbath morning teaching. Today we have the pleasure of presenting broadcast journalist, popular speaker, and author David Dolan. Let's join David as he begins his presentation to our congregation.
Let me, first of all, it's a blessing to be with you this Shabbat. Even though I'm in the area, I'm not in your congregational building, but neither are most of you, I guess, or any of you. But it's a blessing to have been asked to share. And Pastor's ordeal is I'm keeping in prayer, of course. But it's a great blessing to be with you. Behind me, you'll see an Israeli flag that I brought from Israel, and on the sides underneath it is a Israeli bought prayer shawl. Actually, that was given to me as a gift. So it wasn't something I bought, and I think the flag was given to me too. I have a bunch of those. I want to begin by reading just 3 verses from the Psalms. This is Psalm 71. Every year on my birthday, which was last month, and I'm now 70, yeah, I'm going ahead of myself, 67. And every year I ask the Lord for a scripture for the year or two, usually one from the Hebrew Bible and one from the New Testament. And this year I felt the Lord showed me to look in Psalms and Psalm 71 verses 1 through 3. Very appropriate, I think, to what we're going through, what Sue Samuel and Brian just sang about. By the way, they're friends. I know most of the Messianic musicians and artists. I've done a lot of that myself, in fact, over the years. So a blessing to hear that. But rise up, O Lord. This is definitely a word for today. In you, O Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be ashamed. In your righteousness, deliver me. That's what we're all needing now. And rescue me. There's a lot of people literally needing that on earth right now. Incline your ear to me and save me. Be to me a rock of habitation to which I may continually come. You've given commandment to save me. You've given commandment to save me, for you are my rock and my fortress. Well, I was blessed to get that word in particular because I lived in shelters and fortresses and bomb shelters in Israel. I'm from this area, as I think most of you know, from the inland Northwest. Grew up in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. By the way, Mike Gadd, Roy's brother, was a childhood friend and is still a friend of mine today. And we were sad to hear of his passing. And I lost a brother to COVID last October. So Mike and I were commiserating a little bit, but we know they're with the Lord. But I grew up in Coeur d'Alene, raised in a very strongly Roman Catholic family. My dad gave Gonzaga University in Spokane $1 million to build the law library as a gift. He went there in the 40s, and he went there without any tuition. He was the first student they let in who didn't have any money, but his close friend, a doctor from Spokane, recommended him, and he worked as a janitor for his tuition. And then 40 years later, he gave them $1 million to put up a library. He would have never dreamed he'd have that sort of money. But my dad's sister was the head of the convent in North Spokane, the Poor Clare convent, for many years, the Mother Superior, or whatever they're called. We used to go in there as children and be fascinated by these cages, and you couldn't touch them. And they kept silence most of the time unless they were visiting. So different things like that. Went to Catholic school in Coeur d'Alene, and we had in high school, I'll never forget, the first period was always catechism, which was, studying the doctrines and teachings of the Catholic Church, along with some Bible and some other things mixed in, but mostly just the doctrines. And second period was biology, and that was taught by our basketball coach. And he basically said, folks, everything you just heard in the first period, I'm going to say something else now. Not that he wasn't a Catholic, but he said, this is what science is discovering and blah, blah, blah. So the nuns were telling us you're made in the image and likeness of God. Our biology teacher said, no, you're descendants of monkeys and amoebas. So we were acting more like that than we were children of God. So I thought that must be true. That was the era when Time magazine in 1966, I think it was, came out with its most famous, most controversial cover story ever, with the huge headline. Some of you may be old enough to remember this, asking this question: is God dead? And they basically, in their articles, there were several articles, concluded that yes, we can now explain the beginning of the universe. We can explain how we're here, how other things are here, why outer space is there, and all of this stuff. And basically, I read that and thought, I guess that's true. By the way, I recently read Eric Metaxas's excellent book, Is Atheism Dead? And he writes in it that he picked that title deliberately to counter the Time magazine article of many years, its title. And he lays out the evidence since 1966 that has just exploded, if you've been following this at all, in science, in archaeology, in so many areas, to not only suggest, but to basically scream out, there is a God, there is order in the universe. He quotes in his book, Metaxas does something that I used to give as one of my talks when I was traveling around the world and speaking, where I mentioned I was in Hawaii in 1991 for the longest solar eclipse, lunar eclipse, solar eclipse, I guess it is, solar, of the 20th century. And it took place all over the earth, but especially it was clearest over Central Pacific Ocean. And so I flew out there to Hawaii, where I also had a speaking engagement at YWAM there and some other things. But one of my close friends from South Lebanon, I'll talk about that in a second, the bomb shelters, he and his wife were then running a Christian station in Hilo, Hawaii. So he invited me out. And I was working for CBS Radio at the time. They had a crew up on top of the volcano there, which is, I don't know, 12,000, 13,000 feet high, I think, and where there's a big telescope and all of that. And all the world press was there to record this great event, celestial event. And the clouds and fog came in, even though it was the middle of summer. And it turns out the only part of the island where you could see this phenomena was in the south side. They had said the north side would be the best. But I went south because I'm contrary and because the traffic going to the north was so strong. So I went south, and I was in a field with about 150 native Hawaiians. No other white tourists were there, anything like that. When this phenomena happened, when for 8 minutes, the face of the moon covered perfectly the face of the sun, and it was so clear, I mean, the middle of the Pacific, whatever, to the point where we could see with our eyes the explosions coming off of the sun, the flares, solar flares, and people were oohing and ahhing. It was the most spectacular sight I've ever seen in nature or on TV or anything in my life. And as a result of seeing it, I made some money with CBS because the crew up above couldn't see it. So I did the reports over the phone to the network in New York. But what I was saying in my talks was that, you know, and Metaxas quotes all the statistics, but the moon is 186,000 miles from Earth or something like that. The sun is 3 million miles away, so no comparison. The sun is vastly, I don't remember again the exacts, but vastly larger than the moon, thousands of times larger. And yet, from the vantage point of the Earth that day, and any time this occurs around the Earth, the moon and the sun appear to be exactly the same size. The face of the moon exactly covered the face of the sun. And what I used to point out is that if the sun were any bigger or any closer, or the moon any smaller or any further away, or all sorts of combinations, we would never see this phenomena of a total eclipse. We would never have such a demonstration. No, the Bible says, Jeremiah, God has fixed the stars and the planets in their orbits. God has set the laws of science out there. God is expanding, and it says that, the universe. It is still expanding, which we didn't know in 1966 for sure. But after Hubble and some other things since then, we know for sure the earth is indeed constantly expanding, on and on. So there is a God, but I concluded the wrong way. So I got into, what teenagers in the 60s were doing, smoking pot and taking acid even, and drinking and, et cetera. And then a friend got involved with the occult, had been involved with Charles Manson actually in California, but she revived that. She was working in a restaurant where I was working, and she would give us Ouija board readings and different things like that. And I thought it was a little quirky, and my girlfriend was the granddaughter of a pastor, and her father was an elder in their church. So she was very uncomfortable with it, but I kind of followed along with it somewhat. And it was leading nowhere. I won't go into all the details, but my brother came home from university. He's was a teacher, by the way, a professor up at Whitworth until recently for many years. And he was a pastor on the west side of Washington State before that. And he's now in Massachusetts doing a year of interim pastoring for a retiring friend, but then he's coming back to the Northwest. But he became a Christian at a university in Bellingham, came back that summer of '73 and told me that, witnessed to me. I wasn't interested. At Christmas, he gave me a very subtle gift, a Bible, not this one, but a big one like that. And I went, oh, great, and threw it behind my chair. He also gave me a book by a guy named Hal Lindsey called Late Great Planet Earth. Well, I threw them both behind my chair. I wasn't really interested. And 2 weeks later, I won't go into why, but the place I was living in is where this female friend had been doing occult stuff. I had some demonic attacks occur. I now know. At the time, I wasn't sure what was happening. But and I won't go into details, but in the midst of it, I cried out to the Lord and gave my life to him in January of '74. So, and I told my best friend at the time, that evening, he and his girlfriend came over, and I said, I'm going to Israel. And I knew that the moment I gave my life to the Lord. I don't know how or why I knew that, but in the spirit, I knew that, and I told them. And the next day they showed up, and Marty, my friend Marty, had bought a cactus plant for me. He said, here, this is a late Christmas gift. I said, oh, why that? He said, because you got to get used to desert foliage if you're moving to the Middle East, to Israel. I said, well, I didn't say I'm moving there tomorrow, or, I just have a strong sense that this is where I will end up. Excuse me. And so I didn't do that. I went immediately to Bible college in Spokane. It was a later Moody Bible Northwest, if most of you who live there will know of that. And at that time, it was called Inland Empire School of the Bible. And there I heard a missionary from Trans World Radio give a talk about overseas Christian radio. I was already interested. My dad had labeled me Motor Mouth as a boy. I was the news gatherer in the neighborhood. And of course, I'm from Idaho, so I'm naturally born commentator. I saw some people flipped off. They turned off. Oh, well, but I felt radio would be something, or television, or some sort of journalism. My father was an attorney, and we had magazines, and words were all part of our lives very much. So, and my brother became a pastor, and so we both sort of went into that. But I went to Bible college and heard this speaker. Then I went to a broadcasting school in Spokane, a journalism broadcasting school, so that I could prepare to do overseas missionary work at some point, maybe in the Middle East. I still had that strong feeling. And instead, I got a job in Coeur d'Alene at a radio station for 2 years. Then later, I worked at KMBI in Spokane, the oldest Christian station in Spokane, the Moody network, and saw somebody on TV talk on the 700 Club talking about Israel, that he headed a group that took teams of young Christians to Israel for a year. They came from 8-10 countries around the world. There's several hundred there on 8 or 9 different kibbutz settlements. And he said, if you're young and interested and can work and want to travel and have an adventure, then come over. So I immediately contacted them and got signed up, and was in my final months of preparations when Mount St. Helens blew up. Any of you from Spokane will certainly remember that because, well, if you were alive then, that's a long time ago, 1980. But we were dumped with, 3 or 4 inches of ash. And I was working at KMBI at the time. And driving home, it was like in snow and all the street lights were on, etc. So a warning that there's explosions ahead. Well, that November, soon after voting for the first time in a presidential election, I'll tell you, I voted for Reagan. I got on a plane and met teammates from all over America, from Canada, from Great Britain, from Ireland, from, Denmark, Australia, several other countries, Sweden, several other countries in there, Germany. And we all spoke English, was the thing we did share. And we were in a training camp for 2 months. Camp isn't the word, but a Baptist village, it's called, near Tel Aviv. We were there for 2 months, getting lectures and learning some Hebrew and getting acclimated to the culture. And that was a wonderful time. That's where I met who would later become one of my closest friends and mentors, Lance Lambert, who was a close friend of Derek Prince. And I mean, I got to meet all these amazing people in Israel, not just meet them, but become friends with them. And I also, as I mentioned earlier, got to sing a lot there, Barry and Batya Siegel, and several of the people on your radio station. I'm on some of their recordings, and I myself recorded several things there, and I was in choirs, and I was in the first Hebrew opera in modern times, which was written by a Messianic believer, David Dolan, north of Tel Aviv. And he knew I could sing, and he had Tel Aviv opera tenors in his production, but he wanted 1 or 2 believers too. And there were many more female believers, because females, of course, volunteer more and are more ready to do stuff, basically. And so I did that, and I was King David's. It was called David and Bathsheba. I was King David's personal assistant. So I had several roles on stage with just him and me. He was a New York professional opera singer, a believer, and still is today. And it was a lot of fun. But we were shut down by the anti-missionary groups who knew that Loden was a pastor at a Messianic congregation. And it was David and Bathsheba. It had nothing about the Lord in it per se. It was purely from the Hebrew scriptures. A very beautiful production. It's on tape, but they started boycotting it, and so we ended early. But that was my favorite thing to do in Israel. But I digress. We were on this camp, and Lance and others came and speaking to us, getting us ready, and we were told towards the end that there were 2 different kibbutz settlements that were open to take us. One was near the Gaza Strip, but also near the ocean. That sounded great to me. I grew up not next to the ocean and love the ocean. And the other was in the north, right along the border with Lebanon. Well, at the time, the one near Gaza was quiet. That was before much before the Israeli pullout, but it was a quiet period, and they didn't have much action the year that they were there. The northern kibbutz was attacked all the time, and we were warned that that would be the case. So basically, they said, half of you have to go to this one and half to that one. Let us know what your preferences are. So all of the idiots and commentators and stuff like me, all the people that wanted real adventure, picked the north. And sure enough, we were shelled pretty much every day. At that time, Yasser Arafat had a mini state in South Lebanon, and he had taken over the old Crusader castle up there, Beaufort, and he could see into northern Israel, our kibbutz. We could see the castle from our rooms, and he had rockets up there, and they fired them every day. And right next to my kibbutz, our kibbutz, called Hagoshrim, which is Hebrew for the bridge builders, located just below the Golan Heights, and our orchards, our avocado orchards, bordered Lebanon. There was a border fence right through the orchard. So we were right next to the border there. We had infiltrations and we had all sorts of things. But right next to us was an Israeli army base, and it was often targeted, of course, because it was an army base, and often the rockets would stray into our area. So we lived basically in a bomb shelter for several months. And towards the late spring, the U.S. got a kind of ceasefire going, and it was quiet for most of the rest of the year, relatively speaking. I mean, it's in the Middle East, so nothing is quiet for very long, but it was much better than it had been. But during one of those early Katyusha attacks onto the kibbutz, where they were landing right on the kibbutz, I had been assigned the task of getting food for my teammates that day. We took turns. We were in the bomb shelter because there had been shelling earlier that morning, and it was lunchtime, and somebody had to go to the main dining room and pick up the food and bring it back. So I volunteered to do that day. And as I was on my way, a rocket landed pretty close by. You know, it's not fun. I can't watch the news right now much because, you know, I've lived through this too many times, and I have a little bit of post-traumatic. I've covered the uprisings, I've covered the Scud attacks and the rocket attacks and the terror attacks, and one occurred a block from my home in Jerusalem, and I saw the severed heads and, you know, et cetera. So it's not easy to watch that in Ukraine today and see it. But as I heard this explosion, I just thought, what do I do? So I started running, and I was actually running away from our bomb shelter and towards the main dining room, but with no destination. I was just panicking. And I felt, after what seemed like a long time, but it wasn't, probably just a few seconds, I felt the Lord speaking to me, not audibly, but I knew what it was. And he said, "Son, what are you doing? Why are you panicking?" In other words. And of course, you know, in Israel, and those of you who are Jewish know this for sure, that Jews answer a question with another question. So I was getting into that habit. So I said, "What am I doing? What are you doing? Help! Rockets are firing." And strongly into my frightened little brain came one verse, another Psalm 46, "Be still and know that I am God," came into my head. And literally in the Hebrew, it's relax and know that I am God. And I thought, well, that's dumb. There's rockets falling all around. It's not a time to relax. But of course, it's exactly what I needed. And that psalm twice repeats that the God of Jacob is our stronghold. We just heard that word here in the psalm I read earlier: stronghold, protection, shelter. And I mentioned that to our Hebrew teacher, an Israeli fellow, later found the Lord, and others did on the kibbutz, thank God. But he looked it up in the Hebrew Bible, and he said, you know, that's where the committee that makes up modern words in Hebrew for things that didn't exist in ancient times, so there's no ancient Hebrew word for it, but they try to derive it from some existing ancient Hebrew word that's related. And he told me, got the word miklat, which is a bomb shelter, from this very word in the scripture. So then I really understood God was saying, I'm going to be your bomb shelter. Well, I thought, well, why tell me that? And a couple of my teammates said this out loud. Why you and not us? You know, why would he show you this? Well, they all went home, except for a couple stayed on for a few years after we did a year commitment. They mostly went home. I crossed the border into Lebanon to work at a Christian radio station right in the middle of the war zone. And our cars going to and from work were targeted by these rockets. They would put IEDs by the side of the road, explosive devices, that piles of rocks. As you were driving, you had to keep your eyes open on both sides for piles of rocks. And they'd put a string across the road and it'd blow up your car. So all of that sort of thing. And eventually they destroyed the radio station. A few months after I was there, they bombed it and blew up a good part of it. We had a TV station that later CBN inherited, but they blew up that van, some terrorists. So action was going on all the time. So I had a lot of opportunity to be still and know that he is God and to trust in him. But I worked as a DJ, and my most special times, I think my favorite work in all of my life was that late at night, I would play worship music. It was a high praise and worship called Come to the Quiet. And I would play Amy Grant's El Shaddai, which has some Hebrew in it, and it's going out all over Israel. And we were in the biblical tribal land of Naphtali, that the current prime minister is named after, Naphtali Bennett. And I was able to worship the Lord and send that out into the universe and all over Israel and all over the Middle East. I loved it. But I was there for 2 years, then went to Jerusalem. Moody asked me to be a correspondent for them. I did that for 3 years. I worked for CBN in Jerusalem for a couple of years and for their radio network here. And then CBS approached me in 1988 to see if I would. That was right after the first uprising broke out, and they needed more reporters, and they had listened to my work on Moody and for others. And even though they knew I was a Christian, they hired me. But my boss in New York on the phone said, look, we like your work the best of the others we've surveyed. We like your reports and your writing and your presentation, your knowledge. You speak some Hebrew, you understand some Arabic. Spoke quite a bit of Hebrew actually by then, but I'd taken several courses and things. And we'd like to hire you, but we don't want you talking about this prophecy stuff and end of the world stuff and the things you people believe in your reports or mentioning anything like that. And I said, then he tightened the screw. He said, can you promise me you won't be talking about Armageddon or the end of the world or any of these things? I said, I'll just report what happens, what I see, what's actually going on. I said, it might have some prophetic significance, but I won't comment on that. And he went, okay, we'll try, we'll hire you, but we're going to keep our big CBSI, it's not the Christian Broadcasting Service, it's the Columbia Broadcasting System, and we're going to keep our eye on you. And they did. And 12 years later, they fired me because of my second book came out. They didn't like it, was too pro-Israel for them, and et cetera. A Palestinian, Hanan Ashrawi, got me fired. I won't go into that story, but I hadn't brought any of that out in my reports. And my immediate boss told me that she didn't find anything at all, any reason to dismiss me. And just because of a book I'd written, it was pretty well accepted and translated into a bunch of languages and, et cetera. But anyway, that was it for CBS. And that freed me to go back to more Christian media. And I worked for Friends of Israel, doing news reports for them for many years. And that was a great blessing. And moved back to the States in 2013. And I was having more trouble getting a work visa because I was working for these smaller Christian outlets. And CBS, of course, is an international media giant. In the days I worked for them, it was the largest radio network here in the States. There was no CNN or Fox or cable or cell phones or computers. Gosh, what's happened in these 40 plus years? It's really something. But back here now, but I'm following things closely there and still doing weekly radio reports for the Prophecy Today weekend radio program, and people listen all over the world. They get emails from, New Zealand and Asia and I've been all over the world and spoken. I've been in China and various places. I haven't been in Ukraine, but I was in several countries that join it that are in NATO. Slovakia, I spoke there. Romania, never went to Poland, but it's a terrible situation. But, what I told CBS was true. I'll only report what happens. Well, now, if I were reporting for them, it'd be really hard to avoid the topic because we're hearing a phrase quite often right now, which is World War III. President Biden spoke about that on Friday, and we've heard it from all sorts of people that, we could enter what Biden was saying. If we're not careful, we could be part of this and whatever. I say that it's already here. There's over 60 countries now that have sent fighters, or maybe the country hasn't sent them, but people are coming from their countries. Over 60 countries have fighters now in Ukraine, and it's only been going on a few weeks. You may have heard the news. The latest is that the Syrian elite fighters that the Russians trained to do especially street fighting in northern Syria in particular, in Aleppo, which they destroyed, the Russians, in just the same way that they're doing now in Ukrainian cities, using cluster bombs and using these vacuum bombs and, just horrible death-dealing weapons that don't discriminate between soldiers and civilians. And of course, they were then and again shelling deliberately targets that are clearly, maternity wards and apartment buildings and stuff. So terrible. But over 60 countries, the Syrian fighters are, some are already there, others are being shipped up through the Black Sea. It's not very far from the Syrian port of oh gosh, its name is escaping now. I'm having a senior moment, but Latakia, you could say it either way, which is also where Russia has its main naval port now, and an air base next door that they have, since they moved into Syria in 2015, they've expanded the runways and made it capable of all of their aircraft. They've done the same with their port there. So they're putting these Syrians on ships, and it's just a day's journey, day and a half's journey up to the Black Sea and to the fighting. We've also heard that Iranian Revolutionary Guards associated with the Russians in Syria, fighting with them there against, to support the Assad regime against the rebels that didn't want him to continue, that they are heading into the fight. 3,000 American fighters, they say so far, have entered, mostly have some Ukrainian connection, married to a Ukrainian citizen. Spokane, as I'm sure some of you know, has one of the largest Ukrainian communities in North America. And my cardiologist in Coeur d'Alene was from Ukraine and Jewish. And we immediately hit it off a few years back when I first met her, and she has family in Israel, and she spoke a lot about that. So fighters are already coming from all over the place. And in particular, we now know that Russia's bringing in Muslim fighters in particular. They're seeking Chechen fighters, Syrian fighters, Iranian fighters. They're getting some from further east in Indonesia, Malaysia, Chechnya, other places that are mainly Muslim areas. Why? Well, I hate to sound controversial, but jihad. If you believe in jihad, and it's waged not against soldiers only, it's waged against all the infidels, then you're okay with killing civilians. You're okay with suicide attacks and these sorts of deadly things. So they're bringing those types of fighters in. Of course, some are saying it's because the Russians aren't doing nearly as well as they thought, and I think that's pretty obvious by now that what they could do and get away with in Syria, it's harder to do with the media focused on them now, and with it's in Europe. It's in the center of Europe, and it involves other nuclear armed powers. So it's a bit more serious than the Syrian battle was. But I had been saying for some years now that I think World War III is here, and I think it began in 2015 when Syria and Iran entered. When Russia and Iran entered Syria, entered that war, expanded it greatly, which brought in more American involvement. It brought in more French and British involvement. And just at that time, of course, ISIS was growing, and my niece's husband is an Air Force pilot. He was over there, and a bunch of my friends were there. And I think that will be seen in history as when this actually all began. But this is a huge leap forward, of course, what we're seeing now. And it goes along with what I felt the Lord showed me some years ago. It was August of 2017, so 5 years ago now. I felt the Lord in prayer strongly share with me that a big upheaval is coming. And really, I sensed it, a big attack is coming, attack from Asia. And it would disrupt life all over the world, very much in the United States. It would have economic ramifications. It would have social, on and on and on. And to start preparing for that. So I began buying extra toilet paper and extra non-perishable foods and things already in 2017. So when the toilet paper disappeared from the shelves, I was fine. I had a great supply and a lot of food as well. But and that was also from Israel. We always had extra supplies because you never knew when the next war was going to start and when the next attack would take place, and would they shut down the power and the light and the water. And so we all had extra stuff. So it was easy to do. But I assumed at the time it was going to be a military attack from Kim Il-sik, I call him, the North Korean dear leader, who was at that time threatening to blow America up. I mean, he still is, but he was doing it very loudly. That was during Donald Trump's presidency. He was testing weapons every other week. Most of you will remember that, I'm sure. And I thought that's probably where it will happen. I was in Hawaii in January the next year when we had a nuclear missile alert. Again, I think most of you will remember that. The state of Hawaii put out to our telephones a notice that an actual attack was taking place. A missile was heading our direction. This is not a drill. This is real. Get ready. Do what you can to be ready. And I was asleep. It was at 8 o'clock in the morning or so it came in. I was asleep and didn't hear the little beep thing on your phone. I don't keep them near my bed. I'm not attached to the thing. And when I went to the bathroom maybe 20 minutes later, here was this notice. And I realized, I knew from the news that these missiles from Korea took 15 to 20 minutes, they guessed, to hit Hawaii. And of course, the main target would be Pearl Harbor again and Honolulu, our big bases there. And so I realized this had already been out for nearly 20 minutes. So I didn't panic or do anything. I sat calmly on my bed and I said, Lord, if this is the time to go, then take me home. But I heard people screaming in the hallway, and people were being instructed to put their kids in bathtubs and cover them with pillows. And, like that's going to save you from a nuclear attack. But if you're far enough away, that is actually helpful if your eyes don't get the blast and all this. So it didn't, no explosion came. And then to summarize the whole thing, I could talk an hour just about that, but I won't. I could talk an hour about anything. That's, motor mouth, like I said. But summarize it, the press and et cetera said, and the state said it was an accident, that a guy had sent out by accident this notice and blah, blah, blah. But as I read the paper there, the Honolulu Star every day had much more detail. And it quickly became clear that wasn't possible. It took two people, not one, to put such a notice out simultaneously. One had to be the on-duty commander and one the guy at the actual console. So they both simultaneously had to do this by separate computer. It's not possible for it to have happened accidentally. So that got me wondering. And then I got talking to some military guys and gals in Hawaii that are stationed there. Saw them at a restaurant or whatever, saw a couple at the beach. And I told them what I do, and I've been in wars and whatever. And they pointed out, and then it was in the paper, that the military base there and others on the islands put out this notice a minute before the state did. And not only put out the notice, they turned on their warning sirens. So all the soldiers and sailors and Air Force people, they all knew something was happening. It was not a drill. And so they went to what they're supposed to do in such an occasion. Nothing came, and then it was supposedly an accident. Well, what they told me later, a number of them told me, is that probably the Israeli-built Iron Dome system took out that North Korean rocket. The system, and this has been in the news, is stationed in Alaska to capture Russian or North Korean or Chinese rockets heading across the Pacific. And they said, this happened, we got it. And Donald Trump decided that if we admitted it, Kim was attacking one of our major cities and bases in states, it would be war, it'd be full war. And he was hoping to avoid that. And so they came up with this story that this accidental thing happened. At any rate, I thought it would be North Korea. Of course, it was 2 years later, it was China. It was COVID. Whether it was an attack or not, you can have your own opinions, but I'm pretty sure it was, at the very least, we know they did very little to stop it from spreading to the rest of the world, whether it was deliberately leaked or an accident or whatever, or just came from a stray bat. They didn't do much to prevent it from going all over the world. And like I said, it took my life, my brother's life, not me, haven't had it yet, thankfully, and Roy Gadd and many others. And it was an attack, really. And of course, it went on to do what the Lord had told me. It disrupted life, business. Well, I don't need to review all of that. And it's still having major effects upon the states in the world right now. And then comes along Vlad Putin. And I believe he will prove to be the king of the North. I don't believe it, but I suspect strongly he'll be the king of the North in the end, spoken of in Daniel, who attacks from the North and gets involved against the king of the South, and the kings from the East get it. In other words, it ends up with Armageddon. And it starts more regionally, and that's how the previous two world wars did, and then spreads to other parts of the world. And we can be pretty sure that China will go after Taiwan as soon as they feel they can, and that this war will probably not end in any negotiations in Ukraine. It'll probably go on. Putin's determined to reconstitute the old Soviet Union. And of course, it's very threatening with the NATO powers right along there. Well, in my end time novel, I have a similar scenario where the Russians and the Europeans go to war. But that's after the rise of the Antichrist in my novel, who I believe and many believe will come out of Europe, because Daniel said he would come from the people that would destroy the temple. He prophesied that hundreds of years beforehand. And of course, all the liberal skeptics said, oh no, that was written by somebody else afterwards, until they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then they found all these ancient Hebrew prophecies were indeed there for centuries before, they happened, were fulfilled. And we had the Roman destruction in AD 70, and then the final dispersion of the Jews in AD 135. So he'll come out of Europe. I don't think I could name anybody now in Europe that is going to be the candidate in my novel. He is a prince, a literal prince, which Daniel calls him a prince. I don't see any reason he wouldn't actually be that, because the European royalty system is still very strong. They're all very interconnected, very supportive of each other. And that's been going on for centuries. So we'll see about that. But what we do know now is that it's very likely that Europe and Russia will get into a shooting match. Biden is just dancing around saying, we're not involved, we're not involved. Well, of course, we're very involved already. Thankfully, he sent over a few dozen guys that are trained in the use of the Stinger and Javelin missiles that were now copiously, if late, but finally providing to Ukraine. And they are using them very well. Of course, he's not going to send airplanes because that would be war. Well, again, we're supplying one of the sides with heavy weaponry. And not only us, Britain and France and Germany and Romania and Poland and on, and they're taking the refugees in and all of this. So it's already a global conflict. Whether it will go fast or slow, nobody can say. But I do suspect that in the midst of that, and I have this in my novel too, will be Israel will get involved and Iran will get involved in Syria. And I think that the war that's been building between Iran and Israel for decades now is imminent. I believe it is finally right upon us. The signs of that, I could speak all afternoon just about that, but the signs are growing all over the place that that's the case. And will that be Gog and Magog, or the beginning of Gog and Magog? That's what I'm being asked a lot now. Certainly the elements for that final battle are falling into place. The alliance between Russia and Iran was prophesied there in Ezekiel, and it's been building for some years now. The kings of the east that are eventually going to come in are going to be hostile forces back there, and that's been growing. Libya, Ethiopia, Sudan, other people named there, Turkey, have been falling more or less into place. But the Russians right now are having a hard time just in Ukraine. So I don't think they're on the verge at this season of that. But more importantly than that, excuse me, is I don't place Gog and Magog as the next major prophetic event, as many Bible teachers, prophecy teachers do. I've felt for some years, and I've written about it in 2 of my books, that it will be part of the final Battle of Armageddon. And without getting into the weeds too much, the main reasons for that is Israel's at peace when this invasion takes place, Ezekiel says, implying there's been, a real peace where the borders are pretty open and stuff, implying there's been a previous conflict that took away their immediate enemies pretty much, or neutralized them. And this involves this force from the north, far north, of course, Ezekiel said, which is where Russia and Moscow is exactly due north of Jerusalem on the earth, and involve these other regional powers, etc., Muslim powers, we know them to be today. So he's just not in the place ready for that at any moment. But Ezekiel makes very clear Israel will be at peace at the beginning of that, and then at the end of it, these forces are destroyed, completely wiped out, and they bury the dead and get rid of the weapons. And then it says in Ezekiel 39, this will be it, folks. I will now regather the rest of the dispersed Jews. I will be the God of Israel. There will be no more trouble and all this. This is the final act. So that's the main reason I see that as happening at the end of the tribulation period. And also the description of what happens to these invading forces is almost verbatim, word for word, what we have in Revelation of Armageddon, what will be the result of Armageddon, the birds eating the flesh and the on and on. So I think we're going to see that much later, but I think this war between Israel and Iran is imminent, probably this year. And, Russia will support Iran and Syria, and America and Israel's other allies will support Israel. But I think we may well see the fulfillment of prophecy in that. I've talked about this for years, and it's in my novel, which is Isaiah 17. Most of you probably know of that prophecy, so I won't go into it, and I don't want to talk too long here. You'll all be asleep. But Isaiah 17, speaking of the destruction of the city of Damascus, Syria's capital city, 2 or 3 million people in it, like Kiev has, and an old ancient city, far older than Kiev is. And it will be totally wiped out, Ezekiel tells us, completely. It seems to be describing a nuclear attack, especially from Jeremiah 49, elaborates on this, where the soldiers' eyes melt in their sockets and everybody falls dead in the streets and that sort of thing. So it seems to imply that. And, it may be that Putin uses nuclear weapons before then, especially these field nuclear weapons he has. He's talking about it. He's threatening it. So it could well happen. But in my novel, Israel's the first to unleash the nuclear genie, unleash it after 1945 in this war with Syria. And it's because the Syrians hit them with massive amounts of chemical weapons first, and kill tens of thousands of people, which they have the capability to do. And the Hezbollah does too, to send some of these weapons in. And we may see those, of course, we're hearing used by Putin as well in Ukraine. And he was involved with their use in Syria a few years ago against the city of Aleppo and the other places that they struck. They got a very weak response from President Obama, and President Trump took a stronger stand. But President Biden, don't get me started, but you know, they've known that this invasion was likely for some time, and they just did very little to prepare Ukraine or to help Ukraine on the ground, you know, with weaponry and training and stuff. And they did it way too late. But nevertheless, it's happening, but they could have gotten these planes in there, for instance, months ago. They could have done some of these other things, knowing this juggernaut was coming. But politics, and maybe it's deliberate. I don't want to get into conspiracy theories, but, you know, we do have a new world order coming. We have the Antichrist system coming. It involves global economic connectedness, which we have. We have the computer systems, we have the satellites, we have everything that you would need to actually one man and one power control the whole earth, more or less control it. And that is the case today. And I think we will see that as probably a result of this war, depending on how large it gets and how many people are involved, but that. And I do think there is a strong, this is hard to say, but a strong possibility that America will be hit in this war with non-conventional, probably nuclear weapons. Putin's talking about it. Kim is talking about it. The Chinese are hinting at it. And Jonathan Cahn and others have been warning that we have a lot of prophetic indications that judgment is coming to this country. And I think we may well see a nuclear attack by Russian ballistic missiles on our biggest cities and that at some point. And probably Putin would issue an ultimatum to like the 3 Baltic states and or Poland to drop out of NATO now or will invade. And if you don't, we will attack your ally, your NATO alliance. In other words, the United States and Britain and anybody else is fair game then. And of course, they won't agree to those demands from the new Hitler, basically, and will be in a fuller global war. So, but it's all in God's hands what he does to America. But as many have pointed out, we're not listed in the Bible as part of biblical prophecy. And some have said to me, well, but we didn't exist then. Well, neither did Rome exist when Daniel and others prophesied about it existing. They were able to give a clear enough, description of it and tell us it would be in the West and all these sorts of things. So the U.S. could have been in there if God had wanted that. So we'll see. But I think this country is, overdue for some serious judgment. And there's this thing going on the internet now that is supporting Putin and the QAnon thing and all that. And one of the things they're saying is Ukraine is the center of world prostitution and pornography. Well, it has a fair amount of its women that are in Israel and other European countries and stuff that are engaged in that. So does Russia. So do a lot of countries. And the world's biggest pornography producer is not Ukraine, it's America. And it's been America for decades. We produce about 75% of the world's pornography. And it's true that some of the Ukrainian actresses in it are Ukrainian, but they're flown to the States for a couple months or so usually, and they're in several of these porn films. And they make, 5 times what they could back home, and they go back home. So Ukraine is not a perfect country by any means, but it certainly doesn't deserve to be hammered like this. And just for the reason of reconstituting an empire, really no other reason than that. And most Americans don't realize when the Crimea was taken in 2014 by Putin, the Crimea to Ukraine is Florida to America. This is their southern peninsula where they all went on vacation, not all of them, but, very, very common to do that. A beautiful peninsula. True that Russia had a lot of connections there and the Tsars had a palace there and whatever, but it's Ukrainian territory and it was just completely cut off. And Biden and Obama at that time did very little, frankly, to punish Putin for that. And now he's back. Well, it's all in God's hands. I better shut up now. Oh, my goodness. I just looked at the clock. I've been talking an hour or so here, but it's all in his hands, and we can just trust in him as best we can. He is our portable bomb shelter, wherever we are. We can run into his high tower and hide under the shadow of his wings, and the missiles, the arrows that fly in the day won't hit us. And there's so many great scriptural promises about that. And of course, some believe we'll be raptured before there's any real trouble. I've always said there's no guarantee of that at all in the scripture. I personally believe in what's called the Pre-Trib Rapture. Marvin Rosenthal wrote a book about that some years ago, that it will happen after the Antichrist's reign, but at the very end of it, when the wrath of God is about to be poured upon the world at the sixth and seventh trumpets and breaking of the seals, that's when it will happen. But even if it is pre-trib, what is the trib? And I pointed that out all the time, that this isn't even an issue in Africa and in the Middle East and other Christian communities in those type of places, because they're in the tribulation. They've been look at Nigeria, look at what the Christians have suffered there, look at how the Messianic believers are treated, look at how the Arab Christians have been treated, the slaughter in Iraq, the slaughter in northern Syria. We just don't know what might happen. Just because we're the great United States, we're going to get out of it even when everyone else, we just don't know that. And I think the last few years have been humbling to us all and have reminded us just how much we need the Lord and are in his hands. And there's a lot of tears in the end days. There's a lot of struggle. I'm always mindful of, when I'm speaking live, of young people in my audiences who, I'm talking about the end times and here it's coming and it looks like it's near, and they're kind of frowning, like, oh, really? Well, I want to have kids and a family, and, I went to college. I want to use this. They want a normal life, like the people in Ukraine and, many Russians and stuff too. They didn't ask for the troubles that come along. But we do have that promise: in the world ye will have tribulation. And that comes from the Lord himself. So be of good courage. I have overcome the world. So, we have to have a mindset that we're ready to suffer for him. We're ready to pay any price, and that we're committed to him. But, when you're young, it sounds not as exciting when you're 67 and everything's falling apart. I just had a little bit of my shoulder taken out yesterday because they had found a little, it's not the bad kind, but it's all bad, cancer on my back, and they took that off. And, I've got heart problems and one foot is lit and numb because of a fall on my back. But, old age. I don't dye my hair yet, though. It's still fairly dark. My beard's getting lighter all the time. But so I'm looking forward to the new body and the new earth and the new heaven and the things that are promised for us in the future. I'm looking forward to being with the Lord, and of course, our personal rapture could be at any moment. Whenever he calls us home, we're effectively out of here and in his presence. So I'm happy that the indications are that we're getting close to those final days, because of course they are ended with the Lord's return to Jerusalem, to rule and reign during the millennium and forever, to regather the remaining Jewish people and all of his believers from all over the world, to end all sorrow and tears and suffering and mourning and wars, to end all this. So I look forward to that more and more every day, and I'm sure you all do as well. And God bless you and thank you. I don't know if we're still planning to take some questions, but if so, I'm happy to do that. But God bless you all. And maybe one of these days I'll see you in person in your congregation. I'd love that.